I need an identical twins. And there's a couple that needs them, and they're ready to pay triple.
Did you hear that? We need to do something now. Then what do we do? Grace, run! Run faster! They're coming! We need to escape now or they will catch us!
Here's a hair-raising thing. Somewhere in a quiet American town, a woman spent years running a home for children that was really a marketplace for human lives, and two 5-year-old twins were the ones who finally brought her down. Stay with me till the end, because what these kids did takes real guts, and you won't believe how close they came to disappearing forever. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because every single day, we bring you true-to-life inspired stories about survival, courage, and justice finally catching up to the wicked. Today's story is called The Runaway Twins, and I promise you by the time we're done, you'll be gripping your phone or your steering wheel a little tighter. Let's get into it. In the small town of Cedar Hollow, Tennessee, on a cold October night, a young woman named Diane Foster gave birth to identical twin girls in the back room of a rundown clinic on the edge of town. She had waited 9 long months for this moment, dreaming of the life she would build with her husband, James Foster, and their 2 new daughters. The delivery was hard, harder than anyone expected, and after the second baby was placed into her arms, Diane's body simply gave out. The doctors worked for almost an hour to save her, but by sunrise, Diane Foster was gone. James was left standing in a cold hallway holding 2 newborns wrapped in thin hospital blankets, 2 identical little girls, and no idea how he was going to raise them alone. James worked at a lumber yard on the outskirts of Cedar Hollow, barely making enough to keep the lights on in the small trailer he and Diane had shared. He had no family nearby, no savings, and now, no wife. For 3 months, James tried everything he could. He worked double shifts, borrowed money from coworkers, and asked neighbors to watch the twins while he was gone. But it wasn't enough. The babies needed formula, diapers, doctor visits, and James simply could not keep up. One night, sitting alone in that small trailer with his 2 daughters crying in their shared crib, James made the hardest decision of his life. He had heard about a place 2 towns over called Sunrise Haven, a home for children whose parents could not care for them. People in town spoke of it kindly, calling it a blessing for desperate families. James told himself it was temporary, that he would get back on his feet, save enough money, and come back for his children. With tears streaming down his face, he drove to Sunrise Haven early one morning and handed his 6-month-old twin girls over to the woman who ran the place, a woman named Doreen Hatch. Doreen Hatch was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair always pulled into a tight bun, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She spoke softly, promised James that his children would be safe, loved, and well cared for until he was able to return. James left that morning believing he had done the right thing, the only thing he could do. He had no idea that he had just placed his daughters into the hands of a woman running one of the most secretive and evil operations in the entire state. Doreen named the twins Caitlin and Grace, keeping their birth surname of Foster on their paperwork, though almost nobody at Sunrise Haven ever used their last name. To the other children in the home, they were simply Caitlin and Grace, 2 little girls who looked so alike that even the staff sometimes mixed them up, and who always stuck close to each other as if they shared one heartbeat. Sunrise Haven looked, from the outside, like any other group home. It was a large white farmhouse set back from the main road, surrounded by tall oak trees, with a wraparound porch and flower beds that Doreen kept meticulously trimmed. Neighbors who passed by often commented on how peaceful it looked, how lucky those children were to have such a beautiful place to grow up. But behind those white walls, something dark was happening. Sunrise Haven housed anywhere from 12 to 20 children at a time, ranging from infants to early teens. Doreen ran the place with an iron grip, assisted by 2 other adults, a heavy-set man named Walter Higgins, who handled maintenance and transportation, and a younger woman named Priscilla Dunmore, who helped with the younger children. On paper, Sunrise Haven received small stipends from the state and depended on private donations to survive. In reality, the home's true income came from something far more sinister. Every few months, Well-dressed strangers would arrive at Sunrise Haven, always in the evening, always driving unmarked vehicles. Doreen would usher the visiting children into a private sitting room, dress them in their nicest clothes, and present them to these strangers like they were showing off prized livestock. Money would exchange hands in a back office, and within days, one or two children from the home would simply vanish. Doreen always had an explanation ready. She told the remaining children that their friends had been adopted by wonderful families, moving to big cities like Atlanta or Denver for a fresh start. She told the state inspectors, on the rare occasions they visited, that certain children had been placed through a private adoption agency she partnered with. Nobody asked too many questions, because nobody wanted to believe that a woman so respected in the community, a woman who attended church every Sunday and volunteered at town festivals, could possibly be capable of something so monstrous. Caitlin and Grace grew up inside this world without understanding, at first, what was really happening around them. As toddlers, they simply knew that friends they played with sometimes disappeared overnight, and Doreen always had a cheerful story about a new family and a new home. It wasn't until they turned 8 years old that the twins began to notice the cracks in Doreen's story, small details that didn't add up. It started with a boy named Wesley, who had lived at Sunrise Haven for almost 2 years. Wesley was 10 years old, quiet, and had become something of an older brother figure to Caitlin and Grace. One evening, a man in a gray suit arrived at the home, and Doreen called Wesley into the sitting room, dressing him in a stiff-collared shirt he clearly hated. Caitlin, curious, snuck down the back hallway to peek through the cracked door of the sitting room. She watched the man in the gray suit look Wesley over the way someone might inspect a used car, asking Doreen questions about his health, his behavior, whether he had any documented family who might come looking for him. Doreen assured the man that Wesley had no family ties whatsoever, that he was completely available. The next morning, Wesley was gone. Doreen told the other children that a lovely family from Nashville had adopted him and that he was already enrolled in a new school. But Caitlin remembered the way the man in the gray suit had looked at Wesley, cold and calculating, nothing like the warm, excited energy of someone meeting their future son for the first time. That night, Caitlin told Grace what she had seen and heard through the crack in the door. Grace, sharp and observant even at 8 years old, admitted she had noticed strange things too. Money envelopes that Doreen kept locked in a drawer in her office. Late-night phone calls where Doreen spoke in hushed, urgent tones. The way certain children were kept extra clean and well-dressed in the days before a stranger's visit, almost like they were being prepared for something. From that night forward, Caitlin and Grace made a quiet pact. They would watch. They would listen. They would figure out exactly what was happening at Sunrise Haven, even if it meant risking punishment from Doreen, who was known to lock children in the small storage closet under the stairs for even minor disobedience. Over the next 3 years, the twins became silent detectives in their own home. Because they looked so identical, they discovered something the adults never seemed to notice. They could sometimes trade places without anyone realizing it, one of them keeping Doreen occupied in one part of the house while the other slipped off to listen or watch. They learned to move through the farmhouse without making a sound, memorizing which floorboards creaked and which doors could be opened without squeaking. Whenever a visitor's car pulled up the gravel driveway, Caitlin and Grace would find an excuse to be near the sitting room, sometimes pretending to play a board game in the hallway, sometimes hiding in the narrow linen closet that shared a wall with Doreen's office. They began keeping a mental log of every visitor, every child who disappeared afterward, every excuse Doreen gave for their sudden absence. They noticed patterns. The buyers, as the twins began to think of them, almost always arrived on Thursday evenings, when Walter Higgins would take the older teenage residents on a supervised trip into town for ice cream, conveniently clearing the house of anyone old enough to ask difficult questions. The buyers always paid in thick envelopes of cash, which Doreen counted twice before locking away in a small safe hidden behind a painting of a wheat field in her office. And the children, chosen to disappear, were almost always the ones with no visiting family, no one who ever called or wrote letters checking in on them. Children the state system had essentially forgotten. Caitlin and Grace realized with growing horror that this made them prime targets. Their father, James, had never once returned to visit. In the beginning, he called Sunrise Haven every few weeks asking about his daughters, promising he was saving money and would come back for them soon. But those calls grew less frequent, and by the time the twins turned 9, they had stopped altogether. Doreen never told them this directly, but Grace overheard her mention it once during a phone call with Walter, saying, "Those foster twins have no one checking on them anymore, not that it matters." That sentence haunted Grace for weeks. She and Caitlin began preparing for the worst, though they weren't entirely sure what that meant, or what they could even do about it. They started hiding small amounts of food in an old shoebox under a loose floorboard in their shared bedroom, saving crackers and fruit from meals when Doreen wasn't watching. They memorized the roads around Sunrise Haven during their rare supervised walks, noting which direction led toward the center of Cedar Hollow, where they knew there was a police station because they had passed it once on a school field trip years earlier. Back before Doreen decided homeschooling the children herself was more cost-effective and easier to control. By the time the twins turned 11, they had become the 2 oldest children remaining at Sunrise Haven who had never been placed with a family. Every other child who had aged into their early teens without being sold off had eventually been transferred, according to Doreen, to a partner facility in another state for older youth. Caitlin and Grace suspected, though they never had proof, that this transfer was simply another version of the same evil business, just aimed at an older age group of buyers. The twins knew, deep in their bones, that their time was running out. They were exactly the kind of children Doreen's buyers seemed to want most. Young enough to be reshaped into whatever story the buyer wanted, old enough to talk and interact and seem like a real addition to a family, identical and rare enough to fetch a premium price, and completely without anyone in the world checking up on them. The night everything changed started like any other. It was late spring, warm enough that the twins had left their bedroom window cracked open for fresh air. Around 11 at night, long after the younger children had been put to bed, Caitlin woke to the sound of voices drifting up from the porch below their window. She nudged Grace awake, and together they crept to the window, careful to stay in the shadows so no one below would notice them listening. Doreen was on the porch with a man neither twin had ever seen before, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache who kept glancing nervously toward the road, as though worried about being seen. He introduced himself only as Frank, and he spoke to Doreen in a low, business-like tone about a client of his, a couple from out of state who specifically wanted identical twins. They were willing to pay nearly triple the usual price, Frank explained, because identical twins were exceptionally rare and because this particular couple believed twins would bond faster and cause fewer behavioral problems during the adjustment period. Doreen's response made both children's blood run cold. She told Frank that she happened to have the perfect pair, 11-year-old identical twin girls, healthy, well-behaved, no family ties whatsoever. She said the transaction could be arranged within the next 2 weeks, once she finished, in her words, preparing them properly for the transition. Frank asked for photographs, and Doreen promised to have some ready by their next meeting. Before he left, Frank handed her an envelope as a deposit, and Doreen tucked it into the pocket of her cardigan with a small, satisfied smile. Caitlin and Grace sat frozen against the wall beneath their window, long after the porch had gone silent and Doreen had gone back inside. They didn't need to say a word to each other. They both understood with absolute certainty that Doreen had just been talking about them. For the next 2 days, the twins moved through Sunrise Haven like ghosts, trying to appear completely normal while their minds raced through every possible plan. They knew they couldn't tell anyone at the home, not the younger children who wouldn't understand the danger, and certainly not Priscilla or Walter, who they suspected were fully aware of what Doreen was doing and profited from it in some way. They knew calling the police from inside the house was impossible. The only phone was in Doreen's office, always locked when she wasn't using it. They considered trying to write a letter, but they had no idea how mail even worked from inside Sunrise Haven, since Doreen controlled everything that came in or went out. On the 3rd night, Grace noticed something that made their decision urgent. Doreen had laid out 2 sets of new matching dresses on the twins' beds after dinner, nicer than anything they normally wore, along with a note telling them to wear the clothes the following evening for a special visitor. Caitlin and Grace exchanged a look across the room that said everything neither of them could say out loud. This was it. The transaction Frank and Doreen had discussed was happening the very next night. They had less than 24 hours. That night, after the house had gone quiet, and they were certain Doreen, Walter, and Priscilla were all asleep in their respective rooms, Caitlin and Grace packed the small shoebox of hidden food, pulled on their warmest clothes, and eased their bedroom window open as quietly as they possibly could. The drop from the window to the soft grass below wasn't far, maybe 8 feet, and they had practiced climbing down the trellis on the side of the house before, back when they used to sneak out just to look at the stars. This time, their hearts pounded with a fear they had never felt before as they lowered themselves down into the darkness. They ran. They ran across the backyard, through the tree line that bordered the property, and out onto the narrow country road that Caitlin remembered led, eventually, toward the center of Cedar Hollow. Neither of them had ever been allowed to explore beyond the immediate grounds of Sunrise Haven without adult supervision, and the darkness of the rural Tennessee countryside felt enormous and terrifying. But staying was worse. Staying meant becoming another entry in Doreen's ledger, another set of children who simply disappeared with a fabricated story about a new family in a new city. Back at the house, it didn't take long for the alarm to be raised. Doreen had gone to check on the twins around midnight, a habit she had developed on the nights before a transaction, wanting to make sure her merchandise, as she coldly thought of them, hadn't caused any trouble. When she found the open window and the empty beds, she flew into a panic unlike anything Walter or Priscilla had ever seen from her. This wasn't just 2 children running away. This was a threat to the entire operation Doreen had spent over a decade building. If those twins reached the police and told anyone what they had witnessed, everything would come crashing down. Doreen woke Walter immediately, and the two of them set out in his truck, driving the back roads around the property with flashlights, searching the ditches and tree lines for any sign of the missing children. Doreen also made a frantic phone call to Frank, canceling the following night's meeting and warning him that there might be a problem, that the buyers should be told to expect a delay. Frank, furious about the disruption to his business, warned Doreen that if this got out of hand, if the twins actually made it to the authorities, he would make sure she went down alone and took the blame for everything, that his name would never be connected to any of it. Meanwhile, Caitlin and Grace ran until their legs burned and their lungs felt like they were on fire. They stuck to the tree line alongside the road whenever headlights approached in the distance, terrified that it might be Doreen and Walter searching for them. At one point, they had to dive into a shallow ditch and lie completely still as a truck slowed near their location, its headlights sweeping dangerously close to where they hid. They recognized the sound of Walter's truck engine, and they held their breath until it finally passed and continued on down the road. For nearly 3 hours, the twins walked and ran and rested in short bursts, following the road they hoped would lead into town. Around 3 in the morning, exhausted, cold, and disoriented, they spotted the faint glow of streetlights in the distance, the first sign of civilization since they had fled Sunrise Haven. Their hearts lifted with hope, but that hope was short-lived when they realized they had reached not the center of Cedar Hollow, but a small, unfamiliar crossroads with a closed gas station and a dark, empty diner. Unsure of what to do next, and utterly exhausted, the twins huddled behind a dumpster near the closed gas station, trying to figure out their next move. It was there, just before dawn, that a delivery truck driver named Otis Reed pulled into the gas station to fill up, before continuing his early morning route. Otis, a middle-aged man with a kind, weathered face, noticed the 2 shivering, identical little girls the moment he stepped out of his truck. Something about the fear in their eyes told him immediately that this was not a normal situation, that these were not simply 2 kids who had wandered off from home. Otis approached them slowly, keeping his voice calm and gentle, the way you might approach a frightened animal. He asked their names, and after a long moment of hesitation, Caitlin finally spoke, telling him just enough to make it clear they were in danger and needed help, that they couldn't go back to where they had come from, and that they needed to find the police. Otis didn't ask 100 questions right there in the parking lot. He simply told them to climb into his truck, wrapped them both in a spare blanket he kept behind the driver's seat, and drove them straight to the Cedar Hollow Police Department, calling ahead on his radio to let the dispatcher know he was bringing in two children who appeared to be in serious trouble. At the police station, Caitlin and Grace finally told their story to a detective named Walter Simmons, no relation to Walter Higgins back at Sunrise Haven, a soft-spoken but sharp investigator who had spent over 20 years on the force. At first, the story seemed almost too extreme to believe. A group home secretly selling children to buyers, run by a well-respected woman in the community. But something about the specific details the twins provided, the names, the patterns, the description of the hidden safe behind the painting in Doreen's office, the mention of a man named Frank who acted as a middleman, convinced Detective Simmons that this required immediate and serious investigation. He brought in a colleague, an assistant district attorney named Margaret Ellsworth, who specialized in cases involving child welfare and trafficking. Margaret listened to the twins' account with growing alarm, recognizing patterns that matched several unresolved missing children cases from the surrounding counties over the past decade, cases that had always been quietly closed due to lack of evidence or follow-up, cases involving children from group homes, just like Sunrise Haven. Detective Simmons knew that simply showing up at Sunrise Haven with a search warrant might not be enough. Doreen had spent years building a spotless public reputation, and she was smart enough to make sure incriminating evidence could disappear quickly if she got even a hint that the police were closing in. They needed something airtight, something that would catch her in the act. That's when Margaret proposed a plan that would require immense courage from Caitlin and Grace, though thankfully, the plan wouldn't put them directly back in danger inside the house. Using the details the twins provided about Frank and the planned transaction, Detective Simmons and Margaret arranged for an undercover officer to pose as a buyer, reaching out to Frank through the same shadowy channel he had used to communicate his interest to Doreen. It took careful, patient work over the following week, coordinated with state investigators who had jurisdiction to handle what was quickly becoming a much larger case than anyone initially realized. Frank, unaware that his contact had been compromised, arranged a new meeting with Doreen, telling her that his original buyers were still very much interested and simply needed a short delay due to travel, buying investigators the time they needed to prepare. 10 days after Caitlin and Grace ran from Sunrise Haven, an undercover officer posing as a wealthy buyer named Mr. and Mrs. Corwin arrived at the farmhouse for what Doreen believed was a legitimate transaction. Unbeknownst to her, the entire property was surrounded by plainclothes officers, and every word spoken inside that sitting room was being recorded through a hidden device the undercover officers carried. Doreen, feeling confident and unaware that anything was wrong, spoke openly about pricing, about how she selected children with no family ties, and even referenced other successful placements from years past, essentially confessing to a pattern of trafficking that stretched back over a decade. The moment Doreen accepted the marked bills from the undercover officers, Detective Simmons gave the signal, and officers moved in from every direction. Doreen was arrested on the spot, along with Walter Higgins, who was found attempting to destroy financial records in his small office behind the barn. Priscilla Dunmore, who investigators later determined had limited direct involvement but had long suspected the truth and said nothing, was also taken into custody for questioning and eventually cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing crucial testimony about the operation's inner workings. Inside Doreen's office, behind the painting of the wheat field exactly where Grace remembered seeing it, investigators found the hidden safe, containing not only tens of thousands of dollars in cash, but detailed records, ledgers Doreen had foolishly kept, tracking every child who had passed through Sunrise Haven and disappeared, along with payment amounts and, chillingly, notes about buyer preferences. That ledger became the single most important piece of evidence in the case, connecting Doreen and Frank to at least 17 missing children over the previous 11 years. Children whose families and caseworkers had been told they were adopted or transferred, when in reality, they had simply been sold to the highest bidder. Frank himself was arrested within days, once investigators traced the phone number and vehicle registration connected to the sting operation. Under pressure and facing decades in prison, Frank began cooperating with authorities, providing names and information about the network of buyers he had worked with over the years. a network that stretched across 4 different states. This cooperation led to a cascade of additional arrests over the following months, as investigators worked to trace and, in the most fortunate cases, recover children who had been sold years earlier and were still alive, though many had been given new identities and told fabricated stories about their origins by the families who had purchased them. The case of Sunrise Haven became national news within weeks, shocking a country that struggled to understand how something so evil could operate for so long, hidden in plain sight, behind the image of a peaceful white farmhouse and a woman who was, by all outward appearances, a pillar of her small community. Reporters descended on Cedar Hollow and Doreen's church, the same church she had attended every Sunday for over 20 years, released a statement expressing devastation and disbelief, admitting that no one within the congregation had ever suspected the truth. Doreen Hatch was eventually convicted on multiple counts of child trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy, receiving a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Walter Higgins received a sentence of 35 years. Frank, due to his cooperation, received a reduced sentence of 20 years, though many felt this was still far too lenient given the scale of suffering he had helped orchestrate. As for Caitlin and Grace, their courage in running that night, in watching and remembering every detail for years despite the danger, became the very foundation that brought down an operation that had stolen so many young lives. After the arrests, the twins were placed in the temporary care of a licensed foster family in Cedar Hollow, while the state worked to determine the best long-term path forward for them. Detective Simmons and Margaret Ellsworth, both deeply moved by the twins' bravery, stayed closely involved in their case, making sure they received counseling, support, and stability during an incredibly overwhelming time. Word eventually reached their father, James Foster, who had spent years struggling with guilt and shame over having placed his daughters in Sunrise Haven, never imagining what horror lay behind its peaceful facade. When investigators contacted him, James broke down completely, overwhelmed with both relief that his children were alive and safe, and devastating grief over what they had endured because of a decision he had made trying to give them a better chance at life. James worked with the state, underwent the necessary evaluations, and after months of rebuilding trust, of counseling sessions both individually and together, Caitlin and Grace were finally reunited with their father in a small but heartfelt ceremony held at the Cedar Hollow Courthouse, the same building where their case had first been taken seriously by Detective Simmons all those months earlier. Today, years later, Caitlin and Grace Foster are known in their community not as victims, but as survivors whose courage helped shut down a trafficking operation that had operated undetected for over a decade. Their testimony, alongside Priscilla's cooperation and the evidence found in Doreen's ledger, helped identify and begin the long process of reuniting several other children who had been sold through Sunrise Haven with their biological families. Though sadly, not every child could be found or safely returned, given how many years had passed and how far some had been taken from their original homes. This story reminds us of something incredibly important, that evil often hides behind the most respectable, trustworthy faces, and that silence and assumption can allow horrific things to continue for far too long. If there is one lesson to take from Caitlin and Grace's story, it's this. Pay attention to the children around you, whether they're your own, your neighbors, or children in your community who seem to have no one checking in on them. Ask questions when something feels off, even if the person involved seems kind, respected, or above suspicion. Predators and traffickers rely on exactly that kind of blind trust to operate freely. And if you are ever in a position where something doesn't add up, trust that instinct. Because as we saw with these 2 brave girls, sometimes the people with the least power in a situation are the ones who see the truth most clearly. If this story moved you, touched your heart, or opened your eyes to something you hadn't thought about before, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone in your life. Drop a comment below letting us know what part of Caitlin and Grace's journey affected you the most, and let us know what you think should happen to people like Doreen and Frank, who exploit the most vulnerable among us. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and turn on that notification bell, because we bring you powerful, true-to-life stories like this one every single day. Stories of courage, survival, and justice finally being served. Thank you for watching until the very end,
Please
and we'll see
subscribe
you in
to
the
my
next
YouTube
story.
channel and support me. Thank you so much. I love you all. Bye!